everybody. My name is Jessica, and I'm an educator at the Perot Museum of Nature and Science in downtown Dallas. In just a minute, you're going to meet my friend Kristen, who's going to be talking to us today about animal adaptations. So I'm really excited to learn from her. She's going to be asking all of us watching a lot of questions. She might want to know our observations or what we think is special about a certain animal. So we want everyone to participate. If you have the chat available to you, or maybe your teacher does and you're chatting with them, we would love to hear your answers or even your own questions in the chat. If not, you can answer our questions to yourself. If you have a science notebook or an extra piece of paper, you can write them down. Or if you're in the room with someone else, you guys can discuss your answers there. But we definitely want everyone thinking and learning with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen.
Hi everyone, I'm Kristen, and Ms. Jessica's right. We're going to talk about adaptations today. And my first question is, what is an adaptation? Do you know? An adaptation is a physical characteristic or a behavior that an animal does, and that helps them to survive. So what exactly does an animal need in order to survive? Does anyone know? If you said something like food, water, shelter, air to breathe, sunlight, a way to protect themselves, all those are great answers. Animals are able to find all of those things within their habitat. And these adaptations, whether physical or structural or behavioral, allow those animals to have an easier time living within those habitats. So what was the favorite? Did we have, I think people were talking about owls in the chat. So let's start with an owl today. And Miss Jessica is right. I'm going to ask you for some observations today. Let me get our owl set up. What I want you to do is look at my friend here, and I want you to make some observations. Where do you think an owl lives? What do you think they eat? How can they protect themselves? Think about those things whenever you're making your observations, and I'll give you about a minute or so to make some observations, and I'll turn them around in just a second. So just think about those things while you're observing. Okay, so the first thing I noticed about the owl is those really big eyes. This is a great horned owl. So they're pretty big. They only weigh about 2.5 to 3.5 pounds though, and the females are actually larger than the males. But these eyes are so large in comparison to the size of their skull. So if I switch this view, let's look at the skull really quick. Here's the skull of an owl. So we can see these are where the eyes would be on each side. And they're pretty large in comparison to the entire size of the skull. We can also see really well here the beak. This beak is curved. So do you think our owl is a carnivore, omnivore, or herbivore? Now remember, carnivores are meat eaters, omnivores eat plants and meat, and herbivores eat only plants. With the shape of this beak, I think it's safe to assume our great horned owl is a carnivore. They're going to use the tip of their beak in order to pull the meat off of the bones. So that's what that shape of the beak is and how it helps them to get their food. That's not the only thing that helps them catch their prey though. So if we go back to this view, talking about those eyes, they have such big eyes and they're actually bell-shaped, which increases the surface area at the back and allows them to see a lot more. Talked about their beak. Let's talk about their ears. You may think these little tufts of feathers up here are their ears, but that's actually not the case. They do have a really great sense of hearing, and that helps them hunt for their prey, but their ears are actually asymmetrical. So in most humans, our ears are symmetrical and they're on the same place or about the same place on each side of our head. But owls, they have asymmetrical ears. And that means that one ear is higher than the other. Can you think of a way that would be beneficial for an owl? It's kind of like surround sound. So one ear will hear to the side and up, and one ear will hear to the side and down. So they can hear all around them. And this plays a big part whenever they're hunting for their food. So we said they're carnivores, and they might eat little chipmunks or squirrels on the ground, little rodents, or little frogs and toads, amphibians. So what they're going to do is they're going to sit in the tree and perch themselves up there and just listen. And they're going to listen for those rodents scurrying on the ground, messing up with the leaves and hearing that crunching noise. And they're going to be able to pinpoint a more exact location for their prey just with their sense of hearing. That's where their eyesight comes in too. The fact that they're nocturnal, it's dark outside. Those really big eyes are super beneficial whenever they're hunting at night because they allow more light to come inside. They use their sense of sight and their sense of hearing to help them hunt. That's not all. When they're perched up in the branches and listening and they hear something down there, they are going to then swoop down and use their sharp talons to help grab their prey. And then they'll fly back up to the top to the trees where they feel safe. And that's where they'll eat their prey. So if we look at their talons, we'll go back to this view. If we look at their talons, their feet actually have a really interesting shape. They have 3 that go forward and 1 that comes back. That's helpful in a couple of ways. It helps them to grab onto the tree if they're standing on, if they're kind of perching on a branch and waiting, listening, or looking for their prey. But it also helps them to grab their prey whenever they swoop down to catch it. They'll just grab it with those talons and then pull it back up. It's a pretty cool adaptation of their feet. And then they have these nice sharp claws too. So we talked about the sense of hearing, sense of sight. We didn't talk about one way that they protect themselves. So I said that this owl is nocturnal, which means that they are awake and hunting at night and they are asleep during the day. But a lot of animals are awake during the day and asleep at night. So the owls have to have a way to protect themselves while they're sleeping. And one way they do that is through camouflage. So if we look at the feathers here and we look in comparison to the tree, we can see that they're pretty similar in color. And that's because the owl is hoping to blend in with its surroundings. Camouflage. And that's what these little tufts of feathers are for too. They're hoping that maybe they look like twigs or sticks to an animal that's passing by. One thing you may have heard is that an owl can turn its neck all the way around. And I hate to tell you that's incorrect, but it's incorrect. Okay, so let me pull out my paper here. Okay, so if this is our owl and they are looking forward, they cannot turn their head all the way around to see behind them. But what they can do is they can turn their head about 270 degrees, which is almost all the way around. If you're looking at a circle, and we divide it into 4, that means they can see 3/4 of the circle. And so this would be the way they're facing. They can see almost everything except for that little space behind them. Now, do you think humans can turn their heads all the way around like an owl can, 270 degrees? I don't think so. We can turn our head about 180 degrees, so from shoulder to shoulder. But owls have extra bones in their neck, and that's what helps them to turn their neck all the way around. So humans only have about 7 bones in our necks, but owls can have up to 14. And then they have extra blood vessels so that the blood doesn't get cut off to their brain whenever they're trying to turn their heads really far. So you can't see those adaptations, but they're there. The other thing we can't see is their bones inside their bodies. They have hollow bones, which are really light. The lightness of those bones and the lightness of the feathers help them to be able to fly. And owls are silent flyers, which means they have serrated feathers to help them sneak up and swoop down on their prey. You can see the color here and how it looks like those branches of the tree and helps it camouflage as well.
Kristen, are you ready for a question or two about owls?
I am.
So if you have a question, you can go ahead and start typing it in the chat. We did have a couple come in from Monty wanting to know, 1, if the owl didn't have the ability of good hearing and sight, what might happen? And 2, will they ever get hunted by their predators?
So let me answer the second question first. Typically, owls are more of the top predators in an area, and that's not always the case. But there aren't a lot of predators that the owl has. And then the first question about what if they didn't have incredible eyesight and a really great sense of hearing, they'd probably have more trouble acquiring that food. They'd have to spend more time observing their surroundings and finding other ways to adapt to that. So right now, they don't have a very good sense of smell. But if the eyesight and the hearing was weakened over time, they might adapt a better sense of smell to be able to seek out that prey. Were there any other questions?
I don't see any more in the chat yet, but if you think of one when we've moved on to another animal, go ahead and still enter it, and hopefully we'll have time at the end and we can go back and answer some more questions.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so our next animal. So Ms. Jessica, we did your favorite. Now we're gonna do my favorite. Let's do a frog. So here's our bullfrog. And again, I'm going to leave him here for a second. I want you to make some observations. Where does a frog live? What do they eat? How do they survive and find all of those things? Food, water, shelter, protection. And I'll put a toad next to him. They're similar. We'll talk about both of those. So I see a question in the chat about the owl. If you have less bones, doesn't it make it easier to turn your neck? Because if you have more bones, wouldn't it be harder because the bones are blocking it? Those bones actually add more spaces for muscles to connect so that they can turn their head a little bit farther. So you need all those muscles in order to turn it. And I don't think owls have a lot of predators. They tend to be the top predator within that area. And it depends on what kind of owl you're talking about. The great horned owl are normally top predators, but if you had a smaller owl, they might be hunted by, I don't know, I think snakes could eat an owl, Ms. Jessica, or other larger birds. For the great horned owl, the normal size is about 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, but other birds and other owls can be much smaller, so their weight would be less, or larger and their weight would be more. Okay, do we make some observations about our frogs and our toads? This is one of my favorite animals to talk about, so I'm super excited that I get to talk about a frog today. Let's talk about where they live. Frogs are amphibians, which means they need to spend a lot of their time within the water and part of the time of their life out of water. So they're always going to be found near water sources like rivers and streams and lakes. Bullfrogs are mostly aquatic, so they'll be found really close to the water, if not in the water most of the time. What does a frog eat? Remember those words. Are they a carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore? Frogs eat insects, so that makes them a carnivore, or more specifically, an insectivore. But that's at this stage of life. Most amphibians go through a process called metamorphosis, which means that their body style changes as they go through different stages of life. And so frogs start out as eggs, and then they turn into tadpoles. When they're tadpoles, they eat algae, and they're an herbivore. And they have gills that breathe, so they can breathe underwater. And then they turn into a froglet or a toadlet, and then into a frog or a toad. And not all frogs go through all of those stages, but they go through some sort of metamorphosis. Let's see. I think the question was amphibians. Why are frogs amphibians? They have this smooth skin, and we'll look at a reptile later. So frogs usually have this smooth, moist skin, and toads, they're a little bumpy, but they're still amphibians because they live in that water. And whenever they lay eggs, amphibians have a more jelly-like egg. And they have to be laid really close to water, whereas reptiles, they have an extra outer layer of coating, and they can be laid a little bit farther from water. They don't dry out as easily. So that's one difference. The skin is another one. Reptiles have scales, amphibians don't. Trying to think. They're both ectotherms, which means they cannot regulate their own temperature internally like we can. They need heat from the sun in order to warm their bodies, or they'll bury themselves to cool down or go into the shade to cool down. So that's something that reptiles and amphibians have in common. Our frog here, going back to eating, they have an adaptation that helps them catch those insects. And it's that long, sticky tongue, and they'll use it to catch the insect and bring it back in. But there's another adaptation that you don't see, and you'll have to watch close whenever you watch a toad or a frog eat in order to see this. But what happens whenever they catch the insect and it goes back into their mouth, they have to swallow it. Now, humans swallow by kind of like pushing our tongue up onto the palate above our mouth, and that's how we are able to swallow and push something down our throat. But frogs need a little bit of help. They don't have that surface at the top of the mouth, like a bone or anything separating their eyes versus the rest of their body. So what they do is they end up closing their eyes and pushing their eyes down into their body. So sink down into their mouth, and that will push the insect down the throat of the frog. Some frogs and toads will have, or some frogs will have a row of teeth, but they're not really good for chewing or anything like that. And it probably wouldn't be enough or substantial enough to keep food in their mouth either. So they use that tongue, and then they use their eyes to push it down their throat. If you look at their feet, they have nice webbed feet that'll help them within the water and outside of it. And then the thing I also notice about our frog are these really long legs. And looking at a bullfrog, bullfrogs are the largest true frog in North America. So they can get pretty big, up to 1 pound in weight and 18 inches in length, which is like 1.5 feet. But most of that length is this leg right here. And it's a very powerful part of their body. And they use that as a form of protection to escape from predators. If they feel threatened at all, they're going to hop or jump away. They use other forms of protection too, such as camouflaging. If we look at their skin, they're going to camouflage or blend in really well with their environment. And toads too. If we look at the skeleton of both a frog and a toad, we can see one of the differences, I think, is how they move away from their predators and prey, or from their predators. I said that frogs have those really large back legs, and we can see in the skeleton how it has those 3 bones, and those are really long, and that's where the jumping is advantage comes from. But if we look at a toad, they're not going to be able to jump nearly as far. Their legs are much shorter than the bullfrogs, much shorter. So they actually have different form of protection. Yes, they camouflage like frogs do, but toads actually also secrete a poison from these glands right behind their eyes. And so if I think of it, if your dog ever picks one up and they start foaming at the mouth, it's that poison that a toad secretes. And they're hoping that the predator that picks them up will then drop them because it'll taste so bitter and bad that they won't want to eat the toad anymore.
We have a lot of questions coming in about our frogs and toads.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Let's start with, why are all frogs not the same color?
So we have to think about what environment they're living in. And then some frogs and snakes and even insects, they use something called aposematic camouflage, which means that they use really, really bright colors instead. And that there's just like a warning to say I'm poisonous or venomous. I don't taste good. I taste really bad. And just a really bright warning for other predators to say, I'm not very tasty. Please don't eat me. And that's why you see those poison dart frogs that are like bright blue and orange and yellow. And then you also have green tree frogs, which are really bright green sometimes. And that's just to help them camouflage with the leaves of the trees that are there.
We got a lot about how frogs can leap, which I think we talked about a lot with those really strong and large back legs. Let's see.
I don't know how far bullfrogs can jump. If that was one of the questions, I don't know that off the top of my head. So that's something that I'll have to go back and look up after this program.
What animals prey on frogs?
Oh, snakes, owls, possums, raccoons, anything like that, anything that's bigger than them.
How can frogs swim?
So whenever they're a tadpole, they actually don't have legs. They look more like a fish with a tail that helps them to swim. And then as a froglet or a toadlet, they start to grow these back legs, but they still have a tail that helps them get through the water. I don't know if frogs in this stage of life can really swim very well, or if they're hopping and jumping along the bottom of the water. I don't know.
People too about, are frogs poisonous?
Oh, some frogs are poisonous, but not all frogs. And that's the same thing for toads. Not all of them are poisonous. And we'll talk more about poison and venom later. So some can be.
I love all of the questions coming in and how curious everyone is. We're going to move on to our next animal so we have time to cover more. But if we have time at the end, we can try to come back to some of these because these are awesome questions.
One of my favorites. Okay, so let's do my friend the possum next. I think I said the bullfrog was my favorite, but possums might be my second favorite. They are so cute. I just love it so much. So with this possum, again, make some observations. Where do they live? What are they eating? How are they getting that food? How are they protecting themselves?
While they're making their observations, Kristen, we had a few come in about the frog's eyesight, if they have good eyesight or not.
I actually don't know if frogs have good eyesight. I would assume they need some sort of good eyesight in order to catch those insects and be able to see them. It's almost like, I think about it as Harry Potter looking after the snitch in the Quidditch. I would assume that they'd have to have really good eyesight in order to see those insects. But again, I'll have to look that up after this program. Okay, I see a couple of questions coming in about the possum already, so I'll get started. So this is our possum. This is a mammal. So, and more specifically, it is a marsupial, which means that, yes, it gives birth to live babies, but then the live babies go into a pouch. And so female possums will have a pouch on their belly. And those possums will stay in the pouch for about 3 months. After those 3 months, then they'll come and hang out on the mom's back for a couple of weeks before they even start to walk on their own. And I have to say, baby possums are super cute because when they get lost, they make little sneezy noises, and that's how their mom finds them. And I think that is just adorable. So what do you think a possum eats? Do you think that they are a carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore? And maybe this will help if we look at his skull. So here's the skull of a possum. So this would be its nose, its snout, and then this is where its eyes would be, and its brain back here. And it's got this nice crest on the top of its skull. That allows for muscle attachment. But if you look at its teeth, thinking about if it's an omnivore, herbivore, or carnivore, we see that it has sharp canines, but it's also got these molars at the back, which aren't flat, they have little points to them. So to me, this indicates that a possum is an omnivore. He may use these canines to help pull meat off the bone, but he's also going to chew things like berries, nuts, and seeds with these back molars. So possums are omnivores. They eat both. And they live in urban areas like the city here, so they might even eat our trash. And for what they might eat, as far as they might eat frogs and amphibians, toads, little rodents like mice and stuff like that too.
I'm curious about this next one I see. Do they get cold in the winter with their small amount of fur?
So it is possible, especially on their tail and maybe a little bit on their hands where they're not as well covered with fur. But if we look at the pelt right here, we can see that it's actually pretty thick and long. So they're not going to live super far north where it snows all the time, but they shouldn't have any trouble here in Dallas.
Why do they
Also,
have tails?
why do they have what?
Long tails.
Oh, that's a good question. Their tails, they actually use for a really specific reason. And it's actually called a prehensile tail. Their tails, they use almost like a fifth limb to hold on to things and to help them stabilize themselves as they're climbing up trees and places. So this tail, you may see them whenever they're young, holding themselves upside down from the trees. And that's very possible, but only whenever they're little. This tail is helpful if they need support or something like that. But whenever they're a full-grown adult, the tail cannot support the entire weight of the body. So if you do see a possum hanging upside down from a tree, it's actually pretty young. So that's one way you can tell how old they are is if they are hanging upside down from the trees. But they use that tail to help them support themselves when they're climbing or standing up and things like that. So it's actually like a fifth limb. So we were talking about the fur earlier. Do you think our possum would be good at camouflaging to protect himself? I don't think he would be great at camouflage, but that brings me to a behavioral adaptation in action, something that the possum does in order to protect itself. So everything we've talked about up until now is pretty much a physical adaptation of these animals, but behavioral adaptation, possums actually play dead. And what they do is it's an involuntary response whenever they feel threatened or scared. their body immediately reacts and slows the heart rate and slows the breathing rate so much that possums are actually hoping that their predators will think that they're not alive anymore and not be interested. So that's where playing dead comes from. And our body has a similar response. We call it a fight or flight. We don't fall asleep, but you might put your hands up to protect yourself, or you might run the other way. We have those involuntary responses. So that's a behavior that the possum can't control, but they do exhibit from time to time. Now, the ones I've seen in my area, whenever my dog has found them, they actually do something different. They might stand their ground. Obviously, my dog doesn't threaten them too much. They're not scared enough to fall asleep. But what they do is they kind of stand their ground and they might bare their teeth and they kind of make almost like a hissing noise towards my dog. They're not too scared of him.
So if they're doing these things to protect themselves from their predators, what are their predators?
So their predators might be bobcats or coyotes, large birds of prey, wolves, foxes, things like that. I know it doesn't look like much on their nose, but they actually have a pretty good sense of smell, and that's going to help them find their food too. I don't think I mentioned that earlier.
Here's another interesting one. It might be a do you think question. Do you think their tail is the strongest body part? And if not, which part's the strongest and which is the weakest? That's a tough one.
That is a tough question. I'm not sure about the strongest part of their body, or the weakest, in all honesty. We'd have to look at things like the force of their bite. How much pressure does that equate to? We'd have to look at their hands and how much body weight those can hold up. Things like, and then of course we'd have to look at the tail as well. So I don't know what the strongest part of their body would be. That's a very good question, and I will have to go look it up later. And if I can't answer your question today, I really do encourage you to go look them up. You'll find a lot of other cool facts along the way, and you'll become just as obsessed with these animals as I am. So I really encourage you to go look them up later.
I think we have time for one more possum question before we move on. I'm curious about why are their noses so long? I like that question because I think his long nose makes him so cute.
It does make them so cute. And inside their skull, they actually have, that's going to create lots of surface area within their nasal cavity. And so that's going to increase that sense of smell. So that's part of what leads them to have a great sense of smell. And then I actually saw one question that I can't answer. Are possums fast runners? They're not super fast. They can run up to like, I think it's like 4 miles an hour or something like that, I think. So they're not like super fast, but they're not slow either. Okay, so that was our possum. If questions come in, we'll try to look at them and come back to them. But I'm going to move on to one of our last animals today. And that is our rattlesnake. So let's see, let me zoom in here. And again, our questions are, where does a snake live? What do they eat? Any observations that you want to make about their body or things that you know about snakes and rattlesnakes? This is a Western Diamondback rattlesnake. So that's who we'll be talking about today. And Miss Jessica, let me know if there are any more questions about the possum.
Our most recent question is, do they hibernate in the winter? And I'm not sure if that's a possum question or a snake question, but I'd be curious about both.
I'm not sure about possums. And snakes, it really depends on the climate. If it stays warm, they might not. And frogs frogs will hibernate through the winter too whenever it's colder. But where they hibernate or how long they hibernate really depends on where they live. And then snakes, if they don't hibernate, some of them, so as I said earlier, snakes are ectotherms. They can't control their body temperature. So I can't really tell you that the rattlesnake is nocturnal or diurnal. So there's not really like a good answer for that if they're always active at night or always active during the day. Whenever it's really, really hot during the day, they're more likely to be active at night. Whenever it's cold during the evening and warmer during the day, but not too terribly hot, they're more active during the day. So for snakes, it really depends on what the temperature is in their environment and when they're active.
So I have, why are they called rattlesnake and why do they rattle?
Okay, these are great questions. So we can start with that adaptation on the rattle. And I'm actually gonna change our view really quick to talk about it. So here's our snake and here's the rattle. We can look at their camouflage as well, really well right here. So they're going to camouflage really well with that rocky terrain and in the shade of the rocks within a drier environment. So these guys are more likely to live in West Texas, but we do find them here as well. If we look at the rattle, let's talk about what it comes from. Snakes shed their skin, and people shed our skin too, but we do it like all the time. Snakes do it every once in a while. And it really depends on the conditions of their environment. But we can see they shed the skin from head to tail, all along their body, even over their eyelids. So if I'm really careful here, you can see that even the skin over their eyes is shed. And this shed came from probably like a python. It's not a rattlesnake. But here we can see these are the belly scales. So the scales of the belly are a little different than the scales on top. And that's just because those are the ones that are actually on the surface of the ground moving. And the movement is actually like a wave-like motion from head to tail. So with rattlesnakes, whenever they shed their skin, the last little bit of the shed is actually made into the rattle. So that's where the rattle comes from. And what they do with the rattle is they shake this thing back and forth up to 60 times a second. And that creates that rattling noise. And this noise is actually, snakes get a really bad reputation, especially rattlesnakes, because they can be harmful to humans. But snakes are not looking for humans in order to harm humans. What snakes are doing whenever they're rattling is they're actually trying to tell humans, excuse me, I'm here, I camouflage really well, and you may not be able to see me, but please listen, I am here, please don't step on me, and don't invade my personal bubble. And so it's their way of warning humans or predators that they're in the area, they are feeling threatened, and they will bite you if they have to. So as a human, whenever we're walking on the trail or hiking or exploring and we hear that rattling noise, I know the first instinct is to run away, but what you should do is stay calm and listen. Try to figure out where the rattling noise is coming from, because the last thing you want to do is run into a rattlesnake. So if you pause, listen, and then go in the opposite direction of the rattle, they're less likely to chase you as well. Because again, they're just trying to defend themselves. They are threatened by humans. They're not out to get us. They're just threatened by us. Did I answer all the questions about the rattle? I think I did. And this is a behavioral adaptation. So rattlesnakes are actually pretty friendly, giving us that warning. That's a behavioral adaptation.
We have several questions kind of related. Why are their teeth so sharp? How big are their jaws? And why do snakes bite?
Okay, so anything with a mouth can bite. So I just want to say that. Doesn't mean they will, but they can. So if we look at our taxidermy here, we can really look at those fangs. If it'll zoom in on it. Okay, so we can see those fangs in the mouth. This is a venomous snake, so they have fangs. If we look at the skull, this is the skull of a Western Diamondback. So they can be pretty big. It really depends on food availability and where they are, and things like that, and how big they are. This skull actually has multiple fangs in it, but that is because fangs will eventually fall out, might get stuck in something, and they need to be replaced. So There's multiple in there. If we look at a non-venomous snake, some snakes can have teeth all the way through their mouth. And they still have that curved shape, which I think is really interesting. So if we look back at the fangs, this is an adaptation that helps them to keep food in their mouth. Snakes swallow their food whole. And so these rounded or these curved teeth actually help the snake keep that food in their mouth, because if they're fighting it, they're going to get stuck on these teeth again, and they're going to get stuck in the mouth. So it kind of helps keep that food from wiggling out. Their jaws are actually really loosely attached as well, which means that they can open their mouth really wide and swallow that prey whole. And I said earlier we'd go back to poisonous and venomous. So I want to talk about the difference between the two, because poison and venom are both harmful to humans, but it's all about how it gets into our body. That's the difference. So snakes are venomous, whereas we said toads and frogs are poisonous. Poison is something kind of like poison ivy. It's something that is absorbed through our skin through touching an animal or a plant, or something that happens whenever we ingest the plant or the animal. And I think of poison from Snow White, and she is poisoned by the evil queen, but the apple is what poisons her, and she's not poisoned until she eats the apple. So I immediately think of Snow White and a poison apple, and that's how she gets cursed. Venom is something that is injected into your body. So through the bite of the snake, that's how it gets into your body. So poison, something through our skin or we ingest. Venom is injected into our body, but they can both be harmful to humans. So that's the quick difference there. Was that a question?
About eating, how many times do they eat a day, and what is the largest organism they can consume?
So that's going to depend on how big the snake is. How large of a predator or prey they can consume will depend on how large the snake is. The ones that we had in the museum here got small mice, pretty small mice, because they still need to be able to swallow it and breathe while they swallow. So they can't handle anything too large, but they have really elastic skin, which will help them stretch and kind of swallow it and move it along their body. And they have adaptations in their lungs and their trachea so that they can still breathe when they're swallowing that food. But they don't eat very often. The ones here at the museum probably got fed once a month or so, or every few weeks. So they're not eating extremely often.
We have a couple more questions. Real fast, I'm going to answer one that I was able to look up real fast about how many snake species there are. And there are over 3,000 snake species in the world. And even here in Texas, there's just a little bit over 100 species of snakes just here in Texas. But one I'm really curious about, why don't they have bones?
So I know that snakes kind of look like worms, which worms are boneless, but snakes actually do have a skeleton. And if we look here, put it on the camera for you, this is the skeleton of a snake. We can see their head, and then they have a backbone just like we do that goes all along their body. And instead of having ribs just in one spot, they actually have ribs that go all along their body, almost to the end. And then there's your tail at the very end. So they do have bones.
Okay, we've got about 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask our last two that came in. If you get bit by a poison snake, what do you do? And is that an instinct behavior, having poison in their teeth?
So if you get bit by a venomous snake, what you should do is you should immediately seek out medical attention. A lot of the snakes that we know about and their venom, a lot of them have anti-venom, and that will be at your local hospitals. So I would immediately go to a hospital to get some medical treatment for it. Different venoms do different things to our body, so you'll really need the right one. And then the other one was, is it an instinct behavior having poison in their teeth? It's not an instinct behavior. It's an adaptation. It's a physical adaptation of their bodies in order to protect themselves and to help them to kill their prey. So sometimes snakes will bite a mouse and let it go, and they'll be able to use their tongues to sense the smell and follow the track of the mouse until it's finally dead, and then it will eat the mouse. So they might bite it and let it go, and then just follow the trail and then eat it. So it's an adaptation that helps defend themselves and to eat, really.
So I think that's a really great way to wrap up for the day, reminding ourselves that difference between those physical adaptations about their bodies and their behavioral adaptations about what they're really doing with their bodies. So if we weren't able to answer your questions today, like Kristen said, be sure to look up the answers. You're going to learn a lot. We are still learning all the time. Scientists are still learning all the time. So keep asking those questions, and great observations today. And we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Bye.